Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first in Infotech series of webinars focused on the infrastructure bill. Sorry, took me a minute to get my camera going there. Focused on the infrastructure bill that is making its way through Congress and is certainly top of mind for all of us in the heavy and civil construction industry. We're so happy that you're here, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for our first panel discussion today. So for a little housekeeping first, throughout today's webinar, you will be on mute, but we certainly love your participation. So as usual, there is a Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen, and we ask you to please use this to post any questions you might have throughout the webinar. We will address as many questions as we can at the end with our panelists in a live session toward the end. But don't worry if we don't get to your question, because everyone will receive a follow-up email after the webinar in the next week or so, and all of the answers to every question will be included. Finally, we understand that we're all on Zoom, of course, with varying levels of internet connections, which can sometimes bring challenges. So in case that you might experience any connection issues, please know that we are recording this webinar, and it will also be provided as a follow-up next week. And now for some introductions before we get started. My name is Meg Velozin, and I'm very excited to be here as your moderator. I am a senior strategy analyst with Infotech and have been anxiously awaiting the opportunity to talk about this exciting legislation. I'm joined today by a wonderful group of panelists. I'll start by introducing Terry Bills, is the Transportation Industry Director at Esri. He has over 30 years of experience in transportation planning and policy, information technology, and GIS. He's been with Esri for 16 years. Brian McGinnis leads the public sector division at Trimble. He has 26 years of experience working with government agencies, members of the US Congress, and industry associations on technology advancements in the construction industry, with a particular focus on the use of digital project delivery. Doug Kudo has more than 35 years in public sector executive leadership roles that include the U.S. Air Force, state of Iowa as the CIO, and the state of Michigan as information officer and DOT CIO. Since moving to the private sector, Doug has continued to work with state and local governments with a particular focus on mobility solutions, cloud computing, and cybersecurity. And now, just for a quick check on the agenda so that you can all know what to expect as we work our way through today's webinar. First, I will briefly provide some current context on the bill, but trust me, you're not here to hear from me, so we'll move quickly into our moderated panel, and that's where we intend to spend the majority of our time today. We'll then have a very brief recap of what we heard from the panel and move directly into questions and answers from you, our attendees. We're very, very pleased to have a large and very diverse group of people attending today, including from state agencies, local governments, engineering consulting firms, contractors, and from construction tech. So we definitely look forward to hearing questions from many different perspectives and encourage you to post them to the Q&A throughout the session. So real quickly, again, just for some updated context, I think probably everybody's pretty plugged into what you're reading about here with the bill, but just as to set the stage a little bit, as we all know, the key point that has everyone's attention right now is that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, as we will all be hearing more and more frequently, represents a significant increase in total allocations to infrastructure programs and projects in the US. And it is truly monumental in terms of the scale of dollars being invested in infrastructure, along with some funds that are specifically allocated for areas such as project streamlining, innovations, and technology. So again, I don't want to spend too much time, but we wanted to provide for those that may not have seen the current numbers, some context. So you can see by sector in the table above a high-level breakdown of the bill. The largest share, as you can see, called transportation, includes roads and bridges, freight and passenger rail, transit, ports and inland waterways, and airports. And you can see other sectors include $73 billion for power infrastructure, focused primarily on upgrading the electrical grid, $65 billion for broadband to deploy a quote unquote future-proof network and achieve universal service goals. $55 billion for water infrastructure to upgrade or replace that aging infrastructure. $50 billion toward goals and projects focused on resiliency and cybersecurity, and $21 billion toward environmental remediation for projects such as cleanup of Superfund and brownfield sites, reclaiming abandoned mining lands, and capping gas wells. Given that these types of bill summaries and breakdowns are readily available and with a lot more detail from many publicly available sources that more than likely all of us are looking at on a daily, if not more frequent basis, we want to move on now to our panel where we can dive more deeply below the headlines, hopefully, and talk a little bit about some more of the interesting aspects and anticipated impacts of the bill on our industry, and certainly as well as the effects on the use of technology to meet both the opportunities and challenges that are presented by this monumental infrastructure package. And now I'm very pleased to bring our panelists on stage virtually to join me for our moderated question and answer. So hello, Terry, Brian, and Doug, and thank you so much for being here today. And without further ado, let's dive right into our conversation. I'll ask questions of the group and we'll jump in only when needed to move on to another question, or eventually after about 30 minutes when it's time to wrap up this part of the webinar.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you all for being here. So I'll start with the first question and then I'll let you all just jump in and have the conversation around it. My first question is focused on the timing of the funding. What do you expect to see in terms of the timing of the funding? We hear a lot, traditionally around things like shovel-ready projects that will come out first and that kind of thing. But when do you expect it to really start? When do you expect it to peak? And as importantly, really, how many years out do you expect this funding to last?
Okay. I'm happy to start. I think that this bill is actually going to be quite a bit different than the Recovery Act. I don't think we're really looking at necessarily shovel ready. I think the sort of standard transportation reauthorization will continue the normal DOT spending. Most of this is really going to be focused on discretionary grants. And so, first of all, US DOT is going to have to ramp up. They're going to have to really establish what are the criteria and evaluation criteria and that sort of thing. Some of the figures that I've seen basically say, you're really only going to have maybe 20 billion by maybe even the end of next year. And the real spending probably really won't come until 2025, 2026, and 2027. It's just going to take that long so not, I don't think we're going to see an immediate ramp up, but certainly the numbers are going to be significant, I guess I would say. So
I think I can weigh in a bit in addition to what Terry had just mentioned, Megan. I agree that you're going to see the formula funding as it is today, those standards and practices on block funding for surface transportation continue in a bit of business as usual with more, meaning more funding. So what that will do on surface transportation for highways, bridges, and roads especially is when the new IIJA funding comes down, specifically, we'll start to see advancements of projects out of the state transportation improvement plans or acceleration of those projects listed in the STIPs. So there'll probably be that type of activity as US DOT starts to put their programs together around the additional funding related to discretionary, to Terry's point, the discretionary funding.
Yeah, and I think in addition to what Terry and Brian said, you just don't turn a switch and all of a sudden have billions and billions of dollars of projects. They have to be planned, designed. There are some notions, there's 30-year plans, but there's even the DOTs, if they had all the money right now, would need to ramp up over years to create the projects and actually deliver them.
Right, great. Well, related to that, what can private sector organizations do appropriately to help work with their public sector partners to manage all this incoming funding, and including with the discretionary pieces and the grants that you mentioned?
I think there's several things that sort of the A&E community can do to really help their not only state DOTs but cities and counties. And again, when we're looking at this funding, and because so much of it is really going to be grant and discretionary based, really to work with those agencies, to really partner with them to help them identify the types of projects that will likely get approved. So to help really formulate those grant proposals. And then ultimately, I think, one of the big challenges is how are the DOTs going to ramp up staffing and, sort of in terms of capabilities. And I think that's where a number of the DOTs and cities and counties are really going to have to look to the A&E community for assistance, and how they can really sort of meet some of those staffing and capability challenges.
Yeah, Meg, there's another challenge too, and that is to become more efficient in this environment with all the additional funding. So I think we'll see some technologies advanced a little bit quicker. There'll be a need for data to understand the projects and keep track of them. Things like e-construction and BIM will, I think, be accelerated as well. And just as an early adopter of an electronic bidding system, there's that much more work that has to be processed and kept track of, and understanding economically what the best solutions are by region, by county, by items.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Brian, I think you and Terry are a little, kind of close to the tracking the funding that actually was allocated for technology. Could you speak a little bit to the scale of that relative, and what you think, how that's going to work its way in and be impactful, to Doug's point?
Yes. So to Doug's point, the technology aspect of this is significant. And the reason why is we have been for some time actually have seen the promotion of digital construction and digital technology and digital project delivery creep into already some of the language that we're seeing out there from Federal Highway Administration around their EDC 6 and adoption of that digital as-built and such. So this won't be going away. It will actually be advancing. So what we can do as industry actually is really get in there and work with these agencies and partner with them to ensure that they understand the technology that they have to adopt, because these agencies are going to be in different stages or sequencing on their state of practice, right? So if there's grants and discretionary funding out there and available, but they really don't know how to word or package their grants to optimize the ability to be a successful recipient of the grant, or be accepted as a grant proposal, then we should be in there as industry partners helping them to do so. Because ultimately, until these practices become standard practice, we're going to actually need to lead on the adoption.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. I think that, we in industry really can help play that role. Personally, I was hoping that the bill was actually going to, I don't know, sort of take a stronger stance in terms of really trying to push those technology changes. I know in Europe, really it's coming from their federal governments, very, very strong emphasis on, really sort of BIM for infrastructure and really utilizing the latest, sort of BIM technologies. I was really kind of hoping that that was going to appear in the bill. There was $100 million was set aside to really accelerate the deployment of digital construction technologies. 100 million out of trillion-dollar bill, that's a fairly small amount. So I think in terms of the real push, at least at the moment, it's not in the bill. It will really hopefully come from USDOT as they really sort of set the standards for what they're looking for. And hopefully it will also come from really the community itself that really says, look, we really need to capture the efficiencies that we can gain by really moving to sort of seamless or at least integrated digital construction technologies. And I think that, those are multiple technologies that need to be brought to bear, that where we can gain much greater efficiencies in US construction. We're really sort of some of the most expensive infrastructure in the world, and we need to do something to kind of turn that around.
And Terry, to your point, I think, yes, 100 million is in the bill for the advanced digital construction management or promotion of it, right? That is geared towards technology for smarter, accelerated project delivery. It's not a ton of money. Yes, 100 million is a lot of money, but by comparison, it's not going to change enterprises, so to speak. But what it does do is that, combined with the favorable grant language, can get project specific in states where there hasn't been technology adoption potentially, and leverage that money to say, okay, let's try this project and adopt technology with the grant money we have and take a bit of a risk. And the risk actually you'll find is minimized quite significantly if you have the right technology advisors in there. But I think that's what it's meant to do too, to actually overcome a bit of the apprehension on the risk side.
That makes sense. So it'll hopefully, provide the platform and structure through which some of these maybe pilot project type things, proof of concepts, agencies and others can grab onto and go for it. So
no question.
So I'll move on to, I'm particularly interested as well to learn more from you all and what you expect from the local government point of view. There is a lot of money expected to flow through to local governments for management, and this is my understanding on top of quite a bit of money that's now flowing through American Rescue Plan and other things. So, not all of a sudden, but it might feel to some like all of a sudden local governments have a lot of incoming funds to manage and handle and be transparent about, pick projects, move the money through, report on projects. What do you see as the key opportunities and challenges for municipalities in this quickly changing landscape for them?
Yeah, so a couple of challenges. One, a lot of the money really was sort of focused to make up for deferred maintenance. And of course, we have just a ton of needs in our cities and counties on deferred maintenance. So part of that is, I guess we're going to have the same sort of scaling up issues. How do cities and counties really sort of scale up to really accommodate this? The interesting thing to me was that, again, I was sort of hoping that this might be the sort of moving a bit of the transformation. That is, how do we really transform our cities to the next generation, the next, our transportation networks of the future. And I think a lot of this bill is really kind of focused on really kind of the traditional buckets, if you will, that yes, we're going to be able to repair, not even, it's not going to meet what we really need, but it's going to go a long way to really helping us bring some of our infrastructure back up to sort of regular ratings. But it's not going to necessarily provide that impetus to how do we look ahead to really the transportation networks that we're going to need in the 21st and going forward. And I didn't really see much of that. There's 500 million for smart city initiatives. Again, that's pretty small amount of money in terms of a $1 trillion bill. So a lot of just kind of sort of steady as she goes, although just a lot more, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think there's two components when you talk about local government. And Terry did well talking about the deferred maintenance and the infrastructure we need to work on. They're spread in regions in our larger community is also a focus on mobility, keep moving people, and it's being called mobility on demand. And that gets to investments in our transit systems, roads, parking, bike lanes, trails for hiking, those sort of things. And so there'll be some money for those. And we're seeing as we move toward innovation, emerging technology really is about connected and automated vehicles. And some of the infrastructure will be built as part of this bill, whether it's battery charging stations, the integration between the different modes, a bus, rail, pedestrian kind of mode as people go from point A to point B and choose how they're going to get there.
Yeah, I agree that there is some funding set aside. Unfortunately, I don't see it as really kind of that transformational. Unfortunately, there's small buckets for, and I think we really sort of preserve the 80-20, 80% highway, 20%. And, in my mind, that tells me that we're maybe not investing enough in our cities, and our cities are really where these transformations need to take place. And worldwide, really solving our mobility challenges is, I think, the #1 issue. And it would have been nice had there been a little bit more really to help our cities really sort of grapple and really look at completely new approaches to dealing with our mobility issues so I agree with you. There's money, and that's the challenge for the cities. It would have been nice if there would have been more support for that, I guess.
I would just add one other element to this, though. I think that we have the ability, or the cities do, and the local municipalities and the regional council of governments, wherever they're located throughout the country, to really examine the way they do business, though. They can come in from connected mobility standpoint, the urban planning standpoint and such, and have been doing things a certain way for a very long time, but there is inherently things that can be improved. And if you look and examine your whole practice on asset management and work management for maintenance and community development around permitting and other things, and your operational insights on your capital and investments, when you actually do spend the money, I think there's lots of improvements there that can be made. And this, the money that's coming in from IIJA could be a catalyst to make some of those incremental changes. I don't think that we're going to see vast, huge organizational changes overnight, potentially in the practice, but certainly incremental changes around some key areas is definitely possible, and actually encouraged through IIJA.
Great. You've already touched on it a fair amount, but I'd like to push a little harder, because I feel like, there's certainly workforce development and staffing is definitely a known issue right now across this industry as well as many others. But, with this funding coming through, it's really, it's stressful for a lot of players in the industry. And we're all very aware of, on the public sector side and the private sector side, efforts to ramp up that workforce development and training in many new and important ways that will certainly pan out. Do you, from your perspective, is there anything that you could add to that whole area, and so that all of those that are kind of now getting ready for this to be real and knowing that they may not have the same staffing levels that they might like to have, whether it's public sector or private sector, anything you could share there?
So I think we were already almost to the crisis level even before this bill, so that the baby boom generation is all retiring, and those were big numbers. And I know Federal Highways and DOT has actually had a number of initiatives really looking at, even before this bill, how do they sort of not only backfill that, but we need to sort of staff our transportation agencies with really a much more diverse group of workforce, so that how do we encourage more women engineers, a much more diverse community in our transportation agencies. And that was even before this transportation bill, or before this infrastructure bill. So now we really have a very big issue, and I think that's in a certain sense going to be the challenge for a lot of these agencies. And I think they're going to have to be a lot more creative. I think we're going to have to see apprentice programs, that the DOTs are going to need to run apprentice programs. They're going to have to reach out to their local junior colleges and universities and really establish, sort of effective joint programs to really make these jobs known to a lot of communities that haven't been aware of this. And then how do we really nurture them and bring them on board and give them the training opportunities to, it's going to be a very large challenge, I think. I mean, Brian, Doug.
Yeah, if you're in the private sector and you have excess capacity, I'd go knock on the door of any transportation agency right now. Because the shortage, Terry's right, the shortage has been hitting us. And part of the reason is while we're losing a senior workforce and there's a brain drain occurring, the birth rate is also down. So we're not replacing that population at the same rate we have in the past, which creates some issues on how to grow that technical capacity. There's not an easy answer to that. When I used to try and ramp up technology capacity for my own projects, I'd call my vendors, and I always had a cadre of contractors available, and we'd put them to work. And then they'd, everybody was fine. What we're finding is the contracting community doesn't have that capacity and is not able to respond. I've had a couple of DOTs recently share that with me, that we're getting nervous because they can't go to the outside and just outsource the work right now.
That's a great point, Doug. And we were facing this even before the premise of IIJA, right? And this additional funding, it's only going to be exacerbated by the competition for resources, right? PE specifically. And so to Doug and Terry's point as well, the DEI element of the diversity, equity, inclusion, that's one aspect of it. And I think we're all looking to that to at least help, and we should. But also there's other things, and I can speak just specifically to our organization, but we're looking at folks who want to re-enter the workforce. So re-entering the workforce programs about taking experienced professionals who may not necessarily be exact fit for an engineering role, but we could upskill them or retool a bit of their skill sets and bring them in through retooling and mentoring programs to actually develop them in-house. So a bit of that is going on, at least within our organization, and that seems to be working quite well. And actually, we touched on, we got a couple individuals that were part of the DEI program and the re-entering the workforce program through the re-entering the workforce program. So it had helped because there were a lot of individuals who just took time off, to be full-time mothers, but they were professionals who left the workforce, and that has been successful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll just add firsthand that, we've seen it at Infotech. We work with a lot of agencies, and I really admire their workforce development initiatives right now, because it's a lot of the groundwork of being out there working with the career tech instructors and everybody else. And what's interesting is to where we hope we can help is just make folks, and I think this fits what you're describing, Brian, is make folks aware that it's not always everything out in the field as well. It's some of the business side where these individuals can be upskilled or trained, like you're describing, to do the estimation, the bidding, the construction inspection, the reporting, all those pieces that, you know, with proper exposure and training on some of the tools and the workflows, it may be areas that there's flexibility for people that otherwise may not be able to be out in the field doing site work. So hopefully we can all keep supporting those on the ground initiatives to increase the work and train the workforce.
Well, there's also a new challenge, and the pandemic has highlighted that, but the nature of work is about to substantially change in how we think about it. More organizations have discovered they can get a lot done with their workforce is dispersed and at home. I've got a former classmate who retired from a DOT in the Midwest and continues to do their analysis work as a contractor from Hawaii. And he does his reports, makes his deadlines, and everybody's happy. So they didn't have to replace that knowledge when he left.
Yeah, some creative solutions. Yeah, it's great. Okay, we have time for one more question as part of the panel before we recap and then move into our question and answers from the attendees. When it comes to technology, back to the technology aspects, do you have any, to put you on the spot a little bit, you know, it's just it's another thing for agencies and everybody else, other players, to sort through and figure out and prioritize where to jump in. Is there anything that you would recommend in terms of focus, and or just as importantly, things that might be noise or that you've learned may not at this particular point in time with this money coming down the pike? Obviously we're all being very unbiased toward our own technologies here that we represent, but just generally speaking, is there any guidance you could provide there in terms of how to get started or prioritization?
I actually think that we in the technology industry have a responsibility to kind of make our technologies a little more seamless and a little bit easier to use on the customer side. I know I've sort of been involved in any number of DOTs where they've really brought their vendors together and said, look, we need you guys to figure this out. And I think there's some of that. I think that we need to really show DOTs, cities and counties really kind of what best practice looks like, and how really we can, all work together in a much more sort of open and seamless way. That really the purpose of technology is how do we gain the efficiencies? How do we make the planning, the design, the construction, the operations, and the maintenance of our infrastructure more efficient and more effective? And that's really I think the promise of technology, and at the same time the challenge. And I think that it's really incumbent on us in the technology community to really lead the way there. And I think that's, we all just need to sort of work a little bit more closely together, I guess I would say, and really show our customers what is the art of the possible, and really where they can capture those savings. I think that's the challenge for all of us on this panel.
So I'll add a bit to what Terry had just said, and I agree with him. And one thing is, from the customer point of view, changing an enterprise overnight is not going to happen, or it would be extremely daunting even if you wanted to, right? Adopting technology at the enterprise level across the enterprise, extremely challenging. So what we found to be effective, though, is to not try to effectively change the enterprise overnight, but take bite-sized chunks, if you will, or pieces of technology and adapt them to a standard practice, that becomes the norm. And what I mean by that is select a project or projects or a portfolio of projects. Go introduce technology. Say on this one, we're going to change the practice towards digital delivery, or it might be on the design side, right? Or it could be on the operate side. It doesn't have to be all across the life cycle all at once, but choose where you best feel comfortable, where you think you could see the biggest improvement, and start there and get the right technology advisors in there from across the industry. There's lots out there to be people in and thought leaders to come in and be able to help, but you can start small and accelerate extremely quickly. And that's what we're finding in the industry.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move on to a very, very brief recap and then directly into our attendee Q&A. A real quick recap of what we heard today is that, definitely thanks to our panelists discussion, we learned, that this bill is certainly intended to be transformational and the funding levels are historic, no doubt. And there's a lot in front of everybody to prepare as quickly as possible to work together, although it's not going to happen overnight, even once the bill is signed. And then, working together as partners to deal with all the workforce challenges and introduce some creative approaches there. There was definitely some good discussion as promised around how technology can really, hopefully, participate in a way to make this platform of funding amplify the dollars and, hopefully get more out of the funding that is there. So with that, I will move on now to our discussion around from our attendees from questions that they have submitted. If you'll bear with me for 1 second, I will move on to that. So a first question, panelists, that I'd like to put your way we covered a little bit about this, but it looks like it's a little bit more specific. What have you seen? What have you seen that's worked well in previous periods of large investments in public infrastructure, and what did not work well? Any specific successes or failures that you've seen before?
I think I can start us off with this one. So when we talk prior on large scale infrastructure, or on large scale investment, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, is probably one of the closest federal programs to inject money into the system. And last time it was $48 billion in transportation infrastructure funds, right? So that was injected quickly, and most of the funds were distributed to grant programs through DOT that were already in place. So that was the good news, and the DOTs had 120 days to disperse the funding. So it accelerated things very quickly, and within 6 months, US DOT had about 2,000 transportation projects lined up. Unfortunately, that wasn't transformational. And what I mean by that is, yes, the money hit, yes, there was infrastructure money on transportation side, but the projects tended to be already in advanced stages of delivery, and they weren't necessarily what we would call a transformational project, meaning why we wouldn't see wide scale upgrades to the system. So there wasn't a strategy around that with ARRA. So wide scale upgrades or long-term sustainability, those type of system upgrades are a view towards sustainability and longevity of the assets weren't considered. It was just basically dump money and invigorate the economy, which it was what it was meant to do. But I think IIJA at this point spells out a lot more on the infrastructure long-term capital investment side of the house to facilitate some of those upgrades to the entirety of the system, if you will, meaning our transportation systems, and does have a focus on sustainability.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, I think that, going back to the Recovery Act, it really was, the focus was on shovel ready. One of the things that we typically miss, and even in, most funding bills, is that when we look at the national network and when we look at it from the perspective of supply chain and goods movement and intermodal, there are projects that really cross state boundaries, and unfortunately a lot of times those are not the projects that really get funded, because we really sort of distribute all the funding out to state by state, and as a result we don't take that national view. Well, in the current bill, there is actually funding for some of those projects. Now, perhaps not enough. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more emphasis on really those sort of multi-state types of projects. I think we need to look at and understand what's the real intermodal transportation network that we need to support our complex supply chains for the 21st, and really moving forward to make us much more competitive. And I think that's sometimes what gets lost in the shuffle, is that we put it out to state level projects and we don't take that comprehensive national network view, and I think that's sometimes missing. So
Great. Okay. Well, we have time for one or two for those that are able to stay with us. And again, this will be recorded, but there are a couple of interesting, slightly more specific questions that have come in that I'd like to at least maybe try for two of them. The first one is, my question is, how will funding go to other transportation modes? I'm in the aviation industry, and how will the funding be distributed? All discretionary? And there's more here. And for instance, in the state of Michigan, AIP funding are determined by MDOT, while other states and airport district offices where FAA determines discretionary funding. Will this model continue? Quite specific, but if anybody has any insights on that, if not, we'll do research and provide it as a follow-up. I just thought I'd give it a try.
Doug, you're in Michigan. You want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah,
Okay.
the
Right.
person's correct. There's some states it's done by FAA, some it's done by the DOT and in their modal capacity. But yeah.
Okay.
There was specific funding set aside for airports. I don't have I want to say it was like 67 billion, perhaps a little bit more than that. And a fair bit of that actually will be in the discretionary. So I think it'll be, the specifics, will that be all through FAA? I'm not the best one to answer that. I know FAA will be responsible for some portion of that funding.
Okay. And then I have, if possible, two more, but I think they're pretty quick, yes or no. The first one is anybody aware of or has heard if the feds will prop up a database like they did in ARA to gather where and how each dollar is being spent? Any word on that?
I would assume they're going to have to.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
the public transparency demands that sort of,
Yeah.
tracking.
So we'll assume that will be similar, if
Yeah.
not new and different, improved. Okay. And then
And there's a fair amount of tracking already around jobs,
mhm,
whether they are within the engineering estimates, whether they're overrun or coming in
Gotcha.
under planned budget.
right.
The DOTs need to know that because it helps with your future planning, whether or not you're getting your estimates right.
Yep. Okay. And then this one is, what are your thoughts? And again, we'll have to be quite brief because we're running out of time, but what are your thoughts regarding SBE or MBE, and how much of the work would they be expecting from this bill? Anything specific anybody can add there? If not, we'll respond with some as a follow-up.
Well, there's a focus on promoting small business
Right.
throughout this administration. So I think we'll see some emphasis there. In addition to, is part of also the equity question.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have, go ahead, Terry.
I was going to say, I mean, just about every transportation agency that I deal with equity really has emerged as the number one issue, and number one issue in terms of where do they put their investment dollars, and all across the board, all the way down to sort of their own workforce issues. So I would say it's guaranteed that there's going to be a much stronger emphasis on equity across the board, and I'm sure that will carry over into the contracting as well.
Great. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. But again, we got a couple interesting questions around material shortages and other items. So we will certainly stay committed to providing some answers in writing as a follow-up with our panelists and other research as needed. So I will now move on. Thank you again for submitting questions. And I just have a couple of wrap-up items before we can finish the webinar officially. So as part of our follow-up, you will receive an infrastructure bill survival handbook. Our team here at Infotech has been researching and packaging some great information that we will send to your inbox for reference, and you can feel free, of course, to share it as you would like. And then we also always like to let our audience know about the next webinars that we have scheduled. So please stay tuned and consider joining us, please, for our next panel discussion that will stay focused on the infrastructure bill, but will be focused more specifically on state agencies and municipalities. And then to wrap up completely, we just wanted to say thank you again. So thanks everyone for joining us today for this very timely discussion of the infrastructure bill as it's really finally making its way through. We hope that today's conversation shed some light on what we can all expect and when, and its anticipated impacts on construction program management and technology. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about some of the technology solutions that we're working on with our partners at Esri and Trimble, you can please feel free to reach out to me at the email address above. And you can also visit the partnerships page on our website that's listed above also to learn more about all of our technology partnerships. We feel like it's as important as ever that construction technology companies work together. This is a theme that came up in our panel today to really offer the best, most accessible, easy to use solutions to manage this increasing infrastructure construction budget. And then lastly, and importantly, after the webinar ends, as soon as you leave, you will be redirected to a brief survey that will help us improve our future webinars. So we really rely on this information and would greatly appreciate if you could take just a couple of minutes to complete the survey. So that's it. I just wanted to thank you again for joining Infotech, Esri, and Trimble for today's panel discussion, and we hope you have a really great rest of your day.